My name is James O'Neill. I'm with Raven Careers. I'm going to be here talking to you today about how to use your background and your experience, what we call value, to guide your transition from your military career into civilian life. Many of you may have began to notice there's a bit of a difference between kind of the structure that the military brings to professional development and career advancement versus civilian life that has a little more of a, do whatever you want, whatever makes you happy kind of feel. And that can create a lot of stress for a lot of folks because there's kind of a bit of a lack of direction of what should I be doing, when should I be doing it, and what are my measurable objectives that I should be looking at along the way to make sure that a year from now or 2 years from now or 5 years from now, right, you don't magically end up in the middle of a cornfield that you weren't really anticipating. So what many of you may or may not realize, and I was talking about this with a couple of folks in the room here earlier, is it's very realistic within 2 to 3 years of transitioning out of the Army to be in the right seat of a legacy airliner. And there's two main things that are going to drive your ability to do it in that time frame. So this is one of those foot stompers, write down things. So the first trick to this is going to be each of your individual abilities to translate your military background into language that connects with a civilian recruiter. Has anyone here had trouble with that yet? Okay. That is a consistent sore point that we get with military folks. The language that the military uses is very different than civilian. But it's kind of like thinking about if I were to take an 04 in the Air Force and an 04 in the Army and swap them in branches with no training or no transition program, right? While everybody has some similar experiences, and yes, everybody has served in the US military, I'm sure we can all agree that's going to be somewhat problematic. Well, that's what's facing every military person transitioning into civilian life. They're being placed in a position to explain their background to someone that doesn't really fully understand what that is, especially in those terms. The second thing that is going to be critical to the timeline of your transition from military to civilian life is being able to do a gap analysis of your professional experience and background, okay? And what I mean by that is taking a look at what do you have in your existing experience and your existing background and what is missing that a civilian job wants, right? And the reason why that's so critical to you making that transition on a certain timeline is because if you know what the gaps are before you leave the military, okay, your next move in civilian life is going to be the one that's going to fill those gaps in. So that when you hit certain deliverables, right, you know when is the appropriate time for me to take my resume and my application and hand it off to the legacies, but also knowing comfortably that when you do that, right, hey, my stuff's going towards the top because I've taken the right steps and I've had the right strategy to make that, that transition work. So the two things that we focus on with everybody coming out of the military is language. How do I take your existing experience and communicate that in a way that connects to a civilian recruiter? Okay? If you can't do that, you will spend years out in civilian life trying to accumulate experience you already have, just because it's not being explained properly. And the second component is understanding what gaps you have in your background existingly so that whatever your next move is, it's the right move to fill those gaps in. We need to understand that everybody in this room, while yes, they have military experience, does have slightly different experiences within the military. The easiest way to compare that would maybe be a warrant versus an officer, right? They're going to have different roles and responsibilities, right? Which means you're going to have different type of leadership exposure and different type of exposure in terms of management within flying and so on and so forth. And so as each of you comes out into civilian life, right, it's not so much a one-size-fits-all strategy, which can be a bit tough when we make this transition into civilian life. The strategy really does have to be tailored to each unique experiences. And so what I want to do is I want to start with a bit of a story that kind of crystallizes this, because we get phone calls from military folks on a weekly basis, and usually when we're getting the phone call, they're at the peak of either analysis paralysis, information overload, or frustration. And typically what's generating that frustration is not knowing what they should be doing, when they should be doing it, and how do I measure the success of what I'm doing, right? It's fundamentally not having a plan. And I'm going to explain in a little bit why that happens, but I want to start with kind of this story. So this individual is an 06, okay? He's about 18 years into a 20-year career, and he decides at about the 18-year mark, I want to start thinking about my transition, right? He's definitely not at the point where he needs to start taking definitive action immediately, right? But he wants to have that plan in place. Like many of you in the room, how many people here have instructor experience? Okay. How many stand eval? Okay. So that's all great stuff, right? When we want to talk about not having a repeat experience necessarily, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. So like many of you, he has a background in instructing, background in stand eval. So he does the first natural step that most of our military clients do and reaches out to other folks in the unit that are about 6 months out from retirement. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Okay. And what he starts to notice is there's a lot of stress. Okay. And the stress is happening for different reasons. For some folks, the stress is, I don't have a job yet. This is not good. This is not what I thought was going to happen. Okay. And that you can deal with pretty definitively, right? Because when you're 18 years into a 20-year career, it's really easy. Well, I'm just going to plan, and I won't end up in that position, right? So that one's somewhat easier to solve. The second one, though, is significantly more difficult to solve. And that's the folks that are 6 months out that maybe have 2 or 3 opportunities on the table, and they have no clue what the right one is for them. And it comes to that gap analysis, right? So he takes a look at this confusion and goes, hey, I don't want that to be me, right? Which I'm going to go out on a limb that most of you probably don't want to be in that position either. Okay. So he makes the second logical step that most of our military clients make, and he goes, let me go a little bit further out, and then we reach out to the folks in the unit that are at FedEx, that are at GoJets, that are at Frontier, that are at Delta, that are at American, right? Let me talk to them about how they got there, right? Because maybe if I find someone that's walked the path that I want to, right, they can give me the secrets. So they do. And they reach out to a buddy at Southwest, and they reach out to a buddy at FedEx, and they reach out to a buddy at American, and they reach out to a buddy at GoJets. And like a good military officer, he's taking copious notes on everything that they're saying. And when he takes his notes and he compares them, he realizes when he gets to the fix, 2 guys said you definitely turn left, and 3 said you definitely turn right. Well, who do you trust, right? It's almost like the more responsible he tries to be, the further he steps into trying to put this puzzle together, the more confusion there is. So that's where we step in, to start to pull apart, right? How to communicate the experience, where are the gaps in your background, and letting that guide the process. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in depth here as we move forward. But I first want to explain why that analysis paralysis and that information overload happens. So how many people here have completed Soldier for Life? Okay. Has anyone in here not done a formal military transition program, seminar, something yet? Okay, cool. That's actually more than I would have expected. So for some of you, this will be new. For many of you who have completed some type of military transition, I'm going to explain why, when you sit in these transition programs, it creates confusion. And it's a very simple concept, because military transition programs fundamentally focus on the tools needed to make your transition, okay? And when I say the tools, they're focusing on the resume, they're focusing on the application, they're focusing on the interview prep. And I want to be really clear, those things are very important. But nobody here goes to war without a plan. And no plan survives first contact. So what I mean by that is having a resume and having an application reviewed and having interview prep completed without a strategy is just taking a bunch of assets, throwing them on the battlefield, and not telling anybody how to coordinate or work together. And that's fundamentally how a lot of this transition training works. It focuses on the tools. That focus is what's leading to the analysis paralysis. It's what's leading to the stress. It's what's leading to the anxiety. It's what's leading to the information overload, because it's never telling you what you should be doing, when you should be doing it, and how you should be measuring the success. So I'm here to tell you that if any of you are feeling the stress or the anxiety or the analysis paralysis, it's not your fault. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how to firmly step out of that space, because it is very uncomfortable. And if you're not there yet, I hope you don't get the opportunity to experience that. So if any of you are worried about making this transition into civilian life, okay? Specifically, what will the airlines be like? What are they going to expect from me from training? I've spoken with a number of people in this room that have expressed concern about not wanting to fail training, right? Is the company that I'm going to go to next, how are they going to support me in this new world of completely different language? Real easy example, how many people here use government approach plates? No airline uses those. So many of you are fully capable, fully qualified, instrument-rated pilots, right? Who are going to be given a book that's written in a language that you don't quite 100% understand. So, RTAG has been doing a great job in terms of starting to put those tools, those resources, and those strategies in front of you. And for many of you that have spent the past day and a half walking around the hall, I'm sure you've got to talk to a lot of different folks, right, that are offering a lot of different opinions and thoughts and so on and so forth. My main focus today is going to be on the strategy component, because I'm sure everyone here has received a lot of tools over the past couple of days. So where I want to focus is on the concept that while RTAG is putting a lot of the resources in front of you to help with this transition, fundamentally, right, transitioning a rotary wing pilot into fixed wing aviation is still a relatively new concept, okay? And so we have regionals like GoJets, right, that are fully bought in, that are very familiar with who you are and what your background is. Jason spoke yesterday when we did our interview prep presentation about what the process was like for them about learning how to interview rotary wing pilots so that they weren't asking you questions that really didn't help them better understand your background, okay? You'll notice Frontier is out there, right? The low-cost carriers are starting the process of buying in to rotary to fixed-wing transition pilots. But even for them, it's still new. So there's going to be a learning process on their end on who is a good cultural fit, what experience should they be looking for. But when we take a look at the legacies, right, they still have a very competitive pool. Now, that's not to say that there aren't rotary to fixed-wing transition pilots there, but it's still a relatively new concept. So when each of you is sitting in front of a legacy airline recruiter, the burden is going to be placed on you as the individual to explain to them how you bring value to their organization. We need to make sure you're fully capable of doing that. We did an interview session yesterday, and one of the gentlemen in here told a story about one of the Tell Me About a Time stories that he told. And how at the end of it, the recruiter went kind of glassy-eyed and said, "Thank you for your service." And he made the point that no one ever thanks you for their service when you've told a good story. They're saying that when they don't know what else to say. And so our goal is to make sure that when you're sitting in front of that human being at FedEx, right, at United, at Delta, that you're able to make a personal connection with them in a way that they say, this is somebody that we want here. This is someone that's going to make our organization better, and this is someone I want to sit in the cockpit next to for 4 days, right? And then go out to possibly even dinner with afterwards without kind of wanting to pull my hair out. And so there are two groups of people that I'm looking to talk to today. The first group is the folks that are more than 1 year out from transitioning out of the military. Quick show of hands, how many people in the room are more than a year out of transitioning? Okay. So for everyone that raised their hand that's more than a year out, the main focus here, right, is really going to be on strategy in terms of creating the right framework for what should this transition look like for me, right? What can I do over the next 2 years within the military to continue to fill in any experience gaps that I may have? And when do I need to start thinking about taking the tools and the assets and putting those into play to get me to where I want to go? How many folks here are within a year of leaving the military? Okay. So the folks that are within a year of leaving the military, where I want to focus on with you is what are the definitive actions you have to take over the next year, right? To make sure that the strategy is clear, right? Because for someone that's more than a year out, the strategy is more about how do we keep the pathway open so that when you're within a year, right, you have all the options on the table that you want. For the folks that are within a year, we're now starting to nail down what are the specific paths that we're thinking about walking down, and then what tools do we need to put on the battlefield right now, right, so that we can implement them to make sure that this transition flows as smoothly as possible. So I've been talking to you a lot about strategy, right, without telling you who I am or what my background is. So this is the part where I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit about my experience and what informs kind of some of the secrets and information I'm going to give you moving forward. So there's 3 experiences in my background that really drive the ethos of how Raven Careers works. So the first is I started my career as a civilian. I actually started flight training, or actually I started college just prior to September 11th. And when I came out of college and I was finally qualified to get a professional flying job, I was very fortunate. There was a very narrow window before they changed the age 65 rule where you could get on with an airline and progress very quickly. And I did. And I progressed through the regionals. I moved my way up. And when the regionals started to stagnate a little bit, I had the opportunity to move to a company called NetJets. And I don't know if anybody in this room knows who they are, but they're a corporate company. And I made the decision to go to that corporate company to build turbine PIC time, to make myself more qualified for the majors. Because at that point in time, I was going to be a captain almost immediately after being hired. So I get hired. I'm the youngest pilot on their seniority list. I start ground school on Monday making $32,000 per year. And the union that we had on property passed a new contract on Wednesday that resulting in my pay increasing to $90,000 a year by that Friday. Yep. Now, the next honor that was bestowed upon me was to be the youngest pilot to ever get furloughed in the history of that company. And that was done at the tail end of a horrible economic recession. I was in my mid-20s. I made a decision that at the time seemed like a very good decision to fill in a gap in my experience that would have made me qualified to go to where I wanted to go. And it resulted in me not upgrading to captain and me getting put out on the street with significantly less qualifications than my counterparts. They laid 495 of us off on one day. And so now I'm competing in this market with 494 other pilots that are 15 years older than me, that have 5,000 more hours than I do, and all have IP experience at a 121 regional or corporate or so on and so forth. So I was fortunate they gave me a 3-month period of time to figure out what I was going to do with my life between getting laid off and getting a new job. And I was able to line up 3 different jobs, 2 PIC jet jobs, and 1 as a director of operations of a flight school and turbine management company. And the reason I was able to get those jobs over everybody else was because there was a lot of outside of the cockpit experience that I had gotten involved in at NetJets that I was able to leverage to get me a position that folks with much more flight time than I had could not get. okay? And we're going to talk about that, because one of the cool things about being a military pilot is none of you are just pilots. Everybody in this room has outside the cockpit experience, and I'm telling you that is a major key to what's going to drive your success moving forward. The second part of my background that gave me a tremendous amount of value was I was very fortunate to get a civilian government position in regulatory oversight. And I actually did the 7.6 certification for pilot training and ETOPS for Atlas Air when they brought them on in 2011, I think it was. And I really got to see, through doing oversight of a number of different airlines, how the back end of the airline industry works. And it's quite interesting when you get to see the back end and who they hire and who makes management positions and who doesn't make management positions, and hey, where did that first officer come from? But it really gave me a much more well-rounded perspective of how the airlines work. And the third component of my background that's very valuable in this business that is really going to inform a majority of what I'm going to tell you moving forward is after doing about 2 years of regulatory oversight, I decided being in a cockpit was probably a better job for me than sitting behind a desk. And so I decided to apply for another civilian government position certifying nav aids, ILS approaches. And when I went to go apply for the position, I decided to do some networking and talk with some management pilots. And I was flat told that there was no way I was going to get this job. And the reason I was not going to get the job was because I did not have any prior military experience. And many of you may or may not realize this, but military veterans get a preference when you apply for a civilian government job. And civilian government, like the airlines, I don't know if anyone here has applied for a DAC job, right? But they hire based on an algorithm. And so I went home and I read the application very closely, and I figured out that application. They stopped taking candidates at 125. They interviewed 12. They hired 3. 2 pilots were rotary to aircraft transition pilots, and me. And I've been able to take that opportunity and promote into an instructor position. But the only reason I'm here right now today, I promise you, is not because of my looks. It's because I figured out the algorithm better than everybody else did. And I was able to communicate my experience and fill my gaps in a way that other folks were not able to. If you put information into the application in a format or a way that the application is not made to accept, it will not get scored properly. Now, the second way that the application works that's very similar to an FMS is, let's say we're going to fly a trip across the North Atlantic and we're going to load in the waypoints manually, right? And there's 30 waypoints we have to load in. And we misplace one right where the airway turns 20 degrees. If we don't put the information in that the FMS needs, it cannot take us to a place that we want to go. Just like an airline application. If you don't understand your background and you don't understand how to communicate your background in a way that the application understands and that HR understands, they can't score you on something that they never knew. Understanding how to not misplace decimal points and how to make sure that you load in all the correct waypoints are very, very, very important in your transition moving forward to the major airlines. So this takes me to 3 secrets that we're going to talk about today to start this process of you being able to hit those algorithms. So the first one is how to transition from the military to a legacy the quickest way possible. The single biggest deciding factor is how quickly you get up from getting knocked down. And the reason that I bring this up is because I am quite positive that there is nobody in this room that has not gotten knocked down. And how you're going to get knocked down in civilian life is going to be slightly different. Think about it like American football versus soccer, right? You're both getting knocked down on the field. It's going to be a slightly different way, though. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you a story about a client that I actually had the privilege of working with and started working with him in 2015. But he's the person that I think about personally whenever I'm going through something tough, because he had a lot thrown at him, and he's made lemonade out of lemons. So he came to us in about 2015. He had about 8,000 hours. He did the same career track I did. He left the regionals to come to this company that was going to give him quick PIC time. Now, I got laid off, he didn't. But he also wasn't going anywhere in the company, meaning he was just going to keep building turbine SIC time. So he had been putting in applications over and over and over at all the legacies. He had been updating his resume repeatedly, trying to tweak it and change it. Every time one of his buddies got hired, he'd take a look, grab theirs, and make a correction and submit it. And nothing was happening. But in about the 2015 timeframe, he started to notice a trend of folks that were about 20 years younger than him, because he was in his mid-40s, right? And about 6,000 hours less than him, or 5,000 hours less than him, starting to get hired by certain of the legacy airlines. And it was really starting to kind of crush him, because he couldn't figure out what wasn't connecting. So he reached out. We started with him the way we start with everybody. About a 15-minute conversation to learn about his background. And what I start to notice is the person that I'm talking to on the phone is not the person that's on this resume. So that's where we started. And we rewrote the resume, and we took that, and we put it into the application in a way that not only fixed the misplaced decimal points, but added some of the missing waypoints that weren't in his flight plan. So he took this. About 6 months later, I went to a job fair and was able to get the head of pilot hiring for American Airlines to sit down with him one-on-one for an hour and a half. We were on the Christmas card list at this point. I mean, he was happy, okay? So he comes back, he's super pumped. I mean, this is the first time he's gotten feedback that was positive. About 6 months goes by and I get a phone call. He just had a widowmaker heart attack. And I don't know if anyone here knows what that is, but it's in the title. It's called a widowmaker because the survival rate is single digits. And in the middle of this, he now loses his medical and gets removed from flying status. So we spend the next year and a half working with him while he's going through the process of getting his medical back. And we're not talking about resumes, and we're not talking about applications. We're having very human conversations. About a year and a half goes by. He gets his medical back. He goes back to the company he's at. He gets requalified. And 3 months later, he gets interviewed and gets hired at Alaska Airlines. We're excited at this point. I mean, he's now flying a 737. 6 months later, I get a phone call from him about how he's starting ground school at Southwest. And now I'm pumped. So I say, hey, do you mind if I tell your story? Because I think a lot of people can benefit from this. And he goes, sure, but can I ask you a question? And I said, yeah. United just called me 2 days ago and offered me an interview. I've been to 2 737 recurrents in the past 9 months, and I don't know if I have the heart to do it again, but I can't tell if I'm being stupid. This is a gentleman that went from not knowing if he was ever going to fly an airplane ever again to 3 jobs at 3 legacies in 12 months. So I went onto his Facebook with his permission and stole this the other day. It's been a long time since I could say this with any sincerity, but I love my bleep job. This is what it's all about. It does not matter what company you want to go to, United, Delta, American, Southwest, FedEx, UPS. What matters is that's how you feel every day you wake up and you get into that cockpit. And the path there is going to be your ability to overcome these setbacks. And you're going to do it with the folks that you're going to surround yourself with that when you get knocked down, right, are going to pick you up, brush off the dirt, and start moving forward. On the back end at Raven, we talk about it in terms of giving a big hug. We will frequently have phone calls where we get on the phone and give somebody a big old hug and tell them it's going to be okay, and here's what you need to start doing tomorrow to keep one foot moving in front of the other. You will get there. You just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other.